It ended the way most American wars end. Not with a surrender ceremony on a battleship, not with a victory parade down Fifth Avenue, but with a helicopter lifting off a rooftop, carrying the last Americans out of Saigon as the city fell behind them. The year was 1975, and by every military measure, the United States had lost the Vietnam War. Except, that's not how most Americans remember it. In the decades that followed, the story shifted. Politicians called it a war that was won on the battlefield, but lost at home. Historians argued the real failure was political, not military. Hollywood turned the American soldier into the tragic hero, betrayed, not defeated. And somehow, one of the most catastrophic military failures in modern history became something else entirely. Something more palatable. Something survivable for the national ego. This is not a story about military strategy. It is a story about something far more powerful. The ability of a nation to rewrite its own defeats. And why, in America, that process has been refined into an art form. First, let us be precise about what we are actually arguing here. Because the claim that America has never lost a war is not a factual statement. It is a cultural one. Factually, the United States has lost wars. Korea ended in a stalemate, a ceasefire that still holds today with no peace treaty ever signed. Vietnam ended with a communist government in control of the entire country. The exact outcome American forces spent 20 years and 58,000 lives trying to prevent. Afghanistan ended with the Taliban back in power. In the same month, American troops departed, after 20 years of fighting. By the traditional definition of winning, achieving your stated military and political objectives, these were losses, in some cases, decisive ones. But here is the fascinating and troubling part. The United States has developed an extraordinarily sophisticated system for not calling them that. That system operates on several levels simultaneously. Political framing, media narrative, historical revisionism, and what we might call strategic ambiguity. Together, they form a kind of defeat absorption mechanism, a cultural immune response that kicks in whenever the national narrative of American invincibility is threatened. Understanding how it works tells us something essential, not just about American foreign policy, but about how all-powerful nations manage the psychological cost of military failure. To understand the reframing of defeat, we need to start where the pattern begins in the modern era: Korea. The Korean War began in June 1950, when North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel and swept south. President Truman committed American forces under the banner of the United Nations, and the objective was clear: repel the invasion and restore South Korean sovereignty. For a time, it looked like something far more ambitious. When General MacArthur's forces pushed north toward the Chinese border, there was genuine talk of reunifying the entire peninsula. Then China entered the war, and the front lines collapsed back to roughly where they had started. After 3 years of brutal fighting, over 36,000 Americans dead, the war ended in 1953 with an armistice. The border was restored almost exactly to the pre-war position. Nothing had fundamentally changed. Nothing had been won. And yet, listen to how it was described. Not a loss, not even a draw. It became, and this is the phrase that entered the American vocabulary, the forgotten war. Think about that framing for a moment. The chosen response to a military stalemate was not to analyze it, debate it, or reckon with it. The chosen response was to forget it, to simply not name it, to leave it undeclared in the ledger of American military history. It worked. To this day, most Americans cannot tell you the outcome of the Korean War, which is, of course, the point. If Korea taught America how to forget a loss, Vietnam taught it something more sophisticated: how to reframe one. The Vietnam War lasted nearly 2 decades in its American phase. It consumed 4 presidencies, split the country culturally and politically, and produced no strategic gain. When Saigon fell in April 1975, the government the United States had spent 20 years building and defending collapsed in a matter of days. This was, by any objective measure, a military and strategic defeat. The reframing began almost immediately. The first move was the stab-in-the-back narrative. The war, the argument went, had not been lost by the military. It had been lost by the politicians, by Johnson's micromanagement, by Congress cutting off funding, by the anti-war movement undermining morale at home. The soldiers had done their jobs. America had been betrayed from within. This narrative served a double purpose. It absolved the military of institutional failure, which was important for institutional morale, and it transformed defeat into something more emotionally manageable: betrayal. You can recover from a loss. What you cannot forgive is betrayal, and anger is always easier to live with than shame. The second move was the humanitarian pivot. The war had been about saving the Vietnamese people from communism. When that failed, the emphasis shifted to the suffering of American soldiers, the POWs, the MIAs, the psychological trauma of veterans. The question ceased to be, did we win, and became, did we honor our troops? A question that can always be answered yes, regardless of outcome. The third move was cultural absorption. Hollywood, over the following decade, produced a canon of Vietnam films that transformed the American soldier from a participant in a failed war into a tragic protagonist of a profound moral drama. Apocalypse Now, Platoon, Born on the 4th of July. These films did not celebrate victory, but they made the Vietnam experience about something deeper than victory or defeat. They made it about suffering and meaning and the American soul. By the time the Vietnam Veterans Memorial opened in Washington in 1982, the loss had been metabolized. The war was now about grief, not failure. And grief, unlike failure, can be honored. So how exactly does this process work? What are the specific mechanisms that convert military failure into something less damaging to the national narrative? The first mechanism is objective redefinition. When the original objective cannot be achieved, the objective is quietly changed. In Vietnam, the goal shifted from defeating North Vietnam to achieving peace with honor, a phrase that means nothing militarily, but sounds like a principle worth upholding. In Afghanistan, the original goal of defeating al-Qaeda and dismantling their infrastructure became nation-building, then counterterrorism, then training Afghan forces, then simply maintaining stability. Each redefinition allowed the mission to continue, and the exit, when it came, to be framed as a transition rather than a retreat. The second mechanism is selective timeline framing. Every American military engagement includes phases that can be isolated and declared a success. The invasion of Iraq in 2003, the initial ground campaign, was a stunning military success. Major combat operations ended in weeks. Mission accomplished. The subsequent decade of insurgency, sectarian violence, and instability? That was reconstruction, nation building, a different mission entirely. By separating the phases, you preserve the narrative of military competence even as the broader strategic picture deteriorates. The third mechanism is the externalization of blame.
Losses are explained not as failures of American strategy or capability, but as failures of the allies America was supporting. South Vietnam fell not because America lost, but because the South Vietnamese government was corrupt and its army was unreliable. Afghanistan fell not because of 20 years of failed strategy, but because the Afghan military simply chose not to fight. In both cases, the framing positions America as a competent coach whose team refused to perform, blameless and therefore undefeated. The fourth mechanism is what we might call the moral victory consolation. Even when tactical and strategic failure is undeniable, the narrative pivots to moral achievement. America did not win in Korea, but it demonstrated the resolve of the free world against communist aggression. America did not win in Vietnam, but its soldiers fought with honor and courage. America did not stabilize Afghanistan, but it gave 20 years of possibility to an entire generation of Afghan women and children who otherwise would have had none. These moral framings are not false, but they serve a specific function. They allow defeat to be reinterpreted as a different kind of success, a success of values rather than outcomes. At this point, you may be asking, so what? Nations have always managed the narratives of their wars. Is this uniquely American? Does it actually matter? The answer to both questions is yes. It is not uniquely American, but the American version is distinctive in its scale, sophistication, and institutional support. The United States has the world's largest defense budget, the most globally influential media ecosystem, the most powerful political communication infrastructure, and a cultural tradition of exceptionalism that predisposes both its citizens and its institutions to resist narratives of failure. Other nations absorb military losses differently. France reckons with Algeria differently than America reckons with Vietnam. Britain processed the Falklands and the collapse of empire through entirely different cultural mechanisms.
The American model is particular. It is optimistic. It is individualist. It focuses on the soldier rather than the strategy. And it is relentlessly future-oriented. We learn. We adapt. We will do better next time. The loss, if acknowledged at all, becomes a lesson rather than a verdict. This matters because the failure to honestly reckon with military defeat has direct consequences for policy. If a nation consistently avoids the conclusion that its military strategy failed, it is unlikely to change the strategy. The same approaches, foreign intervention, military support for friendly governments, attempts at nation-building in culturally alien contexts, have been repeated across decades in different theaters with remarkably similar results. Because each previous iteration was not categorized as a failure, there was no institutional mandate to do things differently. This is the operational cost of narrative management. The story that protects the national ego today becomes the strategic blind spot of tomorrow. In August 2021, 20 years of American military presence in Afghanistan ended the way they began, with chaos. The images from Kabul airport, civilians clinging to the sides of departing military aircraft, desperate crowds pressing against the gates, the Taliban standing in the presidential palace in Kabul, circled the globe within hours. By any visual or symbolic measure, this was the most publicly documented military withdrawal in American history. And yet, watch what happened in the days and weeks that followed. The Biden administration and its defenders argued that the chaotic withdrawal was the consequence of the previous administration's deal with the Taliban, not a failure of execution. The previous administration and its defenders argued that they had negotiated a more favorable timeline and that the chaos was Biden's fault for accelerating the withdrawal. The military argued that it had achieved its primary counterterrorism objectives years earlier and that the subsequent mission had been unclear and under-resourced. The intelligence community noted that its assessments had been accurate, but ignored. In each version of this story, the speaker was competent. The failure, if there was one, belonged to someone else. And the 20-year arc of the entire enterprise, the strategic question of whether the intervention was wise, achievable, or sensibly conducted, largely disappeared beneath the rubble of partisan blame assignment. Within months, the public attention had moved on. The war, like Korea before it, was becoming the forgotten war. Not through a conspiracy, not through deliberate suppression, but through the natural operation of the American attention cycle, the demands of domestic politics, and the human preference for forward motion over backward reckoning. Afghanistan will be reframed. It already is being reframed. The only question is, into what? There is a deeper question beneath all of this, one that this video has been building toward. Is the reframing of defeat a problem, or is it a feature? There is a genuine argument for the latter. Nations, like individuals, need functional narratives to sustain themselves. A country that processed every military failure as a catastrophic defeat, a verdict on its worth, its power, its purpose, might find itself paralyzed. The ability to absorb loss, to find meaning in sacrifice, to continue forward without being destroyed by the weight of what did not work. These are not trivial psychological capacities. They may be essential ones. The men and women who served in Korea and Vietnam and Afghanistan did not fail. The policies that sent them and the strategies that deployed them may have. But the individual soldier, sailor, airman, marine, their sacrifice was real. Their courage was real. Honoring that reality, even in the context of strategic failure, is not dishonest. It is necessary. But there is also a cost. A nation that never honestly confronts the limits of its military power is a nation that will continually exceed them. The mythologies that protect the national psyche also derange the national judgment. If America has never lost a war, then the next war can always be won. If defeat is always someone else's fault, strategy never has to change. If sacrifice is always meaningful, no sacrifice ever needs to be avoided. These are the stakes. Not historical, not academic, operational. Lives, treasure, the accumulated cost of a story we keep telling ourselves. The helicopter lifted off from Saigon on April 29, 1975. The last American personnel were gone. The city fell the next day, and the story began. Not the story of what happened, the story of what it meant. The story that could be lived with, the story that could be passed on to children, built into textbooks, inscribed onto memorials, embedded in the culture until it became not the truth exactly, but the truth we needed. America has never actually lost a war. Until it has. Until the reframing starts. Until the story shifts. Until the loss becomes a lesson. The defeat becomes a sacrifice. The failure becomes a tragedy. Tragic, yes, but noble. American. We are a nation built on the belief that the arc of history bends toward us. That we are, in some essential way, on the right side of it. That our power is the instrument of something larger than power. It is a beautiful belief. And it is a dangerous one. Because the cost of never losing, truly, honestly, accountably losing, is that we never fully understand why we fight, what we risk, and what we owe the world when we do. The wars are over. The reframing continues. And somewhere, right now, the next one is already being planned.